Around the time that I was 9 or 10 years old, my immediate family stopped paying visits to my maternal grandmother. I remember it taking me what seems like an unusual amount of time to figure out that we weren't seeing her anymore, and when I did, I just sort of didn't question it. I know that might sound very callous, but I think even though I was very young, I realized what a sensitive subject it was. At that age, it was inconceivable that I'd ever just stop talking to my mom, so I suppose the idea frightened me so much that I just compartmentalized it in a way that only kids seem able to. As I got older, I learned that they didn't talk anymore because they'd had a particularly vicious argument one day and simply decided not to see each other anymore. They hadn't had the best of relationships when my mom was a kid, but as much as there seemed to be a lot of backstory, I don't want to ask about it. It was all just so sad, and whenever she talked about it, the subject always had Mom on the verge of tears. And then as I got older, I started to feel a huge amount of contempt for my grandma because whatever the hell she'd done, it had left my mom heartbroken, and there was just no other word for it. I was more than happy to forget about a person that had hurt my mom that much, and it didn't matter one bit if she was a blood relative or not. But then one day, around Thanksgiving of 2017, Mom called me with some news. Grandma was dying, and if I wanted to see her before she passed, I'd have to do so that week or risk traveling up to her too late. Knowing she was on death's door changed a lot for me, and I strongly considered going to visit her in whatever home or hospice she was in. But then, when I asked where the place was, the answer that came back almost knocked me off my feet. For a start, I was actually kind of surprised that Grandma was even still alive. I'd considered the possibility that she'd passed and we simply hadn't heard about it, so knowing we had one last chance to make peace with her was definitely a big perspective changer. I asked Mom if she'd be heading up to visit Grandma, and when she said no, I asked where Grandma actually was. Mom paused and then said, "She's up in Burlington, at a place called Chittenden." The name didn't ring any bells for me, nor should it now that I think about it. I asked Mom if Chittenden was like the name of her residential home or something, and the reply came back word for word. "Chittenden RCF, honey. Your grandma is in prison." You know, sometimes people will ask you, are you sitting down before they give you some crazy piece of bad news? I know why they ask that now, and I'm not saying I got anywhere close to passing out, but for a second or two, I completely retreated inside of myself. I couldn't think of a single word to say for what felt like a full 60 seconds. It was like a psychic bottleneck or something. 1,000 questions tried to get out at once, and as a result, not a single one made it out of my mouth. I briefly considered driving over to my mom's place so we could talk it out in person, as a conversation like that seemed too weighty for a phone call, but then I just couldn't wait. With each passing second, the curiosity burned brighter and brighter until all I could do was sit myself down on my couch, cradle my head in my hands, and over loudspeaker, ask my mom to tell me everything. Like I said, Mom had a pretty rough childhood, and Grandma was basically the root cause of it. I wouldn't go so far as to call her a psycho or anything, because honestly, that seems like an insult to psychos everywhere. Because according to Mom, Grandma's cruelty wasn't chaotic, it was calculated. I won't go into every little instance of abuse because we'd be here all day if so, and so instead, just take my word that she was quite possibly the worst mother I've ever heard of. Mom put up with it for years until she finally realized that just because it was her mom doing it didn't make it okay. This happened right around the time I was born too, because I guess it had her reflecting on what our relationship might be like. But then, surprisingly, Grandma at least attempted to change her ways. I guess she knew that if she didn't, there's no chance of her developing a relationship with her grandkids, and that change in her behavior meant that until my age was approaching double digits, we either visited her or she visited us at least once or twice a month. That one day, totally out of the blue, Mom gets a call from a man claiming to be Grandma's attorney. Grandma was in jail, and the charges were serious. Mom said she thought the charges might be DUI related, that maybe she'd hit a car driving drunk, or God forbid, maybe even hurt someone too. But regardless of the specifics, Mom starts asking the attorney about the whole bail process because she'd never had to bail anyone out of jail before. And that's when the attorney tells her that bail would be in the region of $500,000. Mom said she felt her stomach tying itself in knots when she heard that number, and it told her everything she needed to know about the severity of the crime. Grandma hadn't just been caught driving after one too many. Whatever she'd done, she was looking at a lengthy prison sentence for it. But what the hell could she have done to warrant such a punishment? When the answer came back, Mom said she had to pick her jaw up off the floor. It just didn't seem real. Grandma was being charged with 4 counts of solicitation to commit murder, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of being an accessory to murder. Long story short, Grandma had been in a long-running dispute with one of her neighbors, some family of young professionals who had 2 young children. We never found out exactly what it was over, but instead of moving or building a higher fence or something, Grandma came up with a different kind of solution to the not-so-neighborly rivalry. She went on the internet and tried to hire a contract killer. I don't know if she just wasn't all that computer literate or it was just all the craziness coming out of her, but the story goes that Grandma plugged in how to hire a hitman into Google, and after an indeterminate period of time, she found herself exchanging emails with a man who claimed to run a secretive murder-for-hire business. Grandma was willing to blow the vast majority of her life savings in her attempt to hire a guy to kill her neighbors. Not just the 2 parents either. She wanted the whole family dead in as nasty and brutal a way as possible. Well, as it turns out, the person that she was talking to wasn't some killer for hire. Grandma had been talking to an undercover cop the whole time. I think if it were a movie, it might actually be kind of funny. The sweet old lady paying some mafia people to whack her neighbors over some dog poop. But the reality isn't funny at all, and it should give you an idea of how Grandma was actually the total opposite of a sweet old lady. She was psycho, probably with some severe but undiagnosed mental illness, but that's still no excuse for making my mom's life a living hell for the first 20 years of her life, and only then being barely tolerable once Mom had escaped her clutches. She was willing to pay a hell of a lot of money to ensure that the 2 children next door, one of which was a literal infant at the time of her arrest, suffered unimaginable pain and suffering before they died, and all because of some bizarre perceived slight on her part, something the neighbors were barely aware that they'd done in the first place. I didn't go up to visit her, and about a month later, word filtered down to us that she'd passed away. Prison officials said her final words involved giving her possessions to an old cellmate. She made no mention of her family at all. Sometimes I think that if I had wanted to see her, she wouldn't even have recognized me. But that's okay because I wouldn't have recognized her either, especially not after learning of the woman she truly was.
Hey everyone, we truly appreciate your support. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel for more upcoming stories and exciting content.
A couple years ago, after helping my elderly parents clear out their attic, I came across a box of old photos. I took a break from cleaning and carrying, then sat down on a full box to peruse them. Each page was a goldmine of nostalgia, but the albums I found the most interesting were the ones depicting my parents' childhoods. There was a whole album featuring shots of my mom's side of the family and another featuring my dad's. But as I went through the latter, I noticed something very curious. I always believed that I had one aunt, and that was it. But in the pictures, my father quite clearly had 2 siblings. At first I thought that it might have been a cousin of his or something, but as I progressed through the album, it became clear that, yes, I had a mystery uncle that I had been completely unaware of for the better part of 4 decades. As you can imagine, my first thought was to ask my mom and dad about it, not in an overly confrontational way, but it wasn't exactly the kind of thing that I was happy to put off until a later date. I wanted to know, and I wanted to know right then and there, but as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. The mysterious uncle was named Joe, and Uncle Joe had passed away when I was still in diapers, which is why I didn't remember him. He and my dad had been close, as the pictures had shown, but that made me all the more curious as to why he'd never mentioned him. When I brought it up, I immediately detected this contempt for my mom, which stood in contrast to the melancholy of my dad. This was my first big clue that whatever happened, it had been some sudden, random tragedy, or at least there had to be a little more to the story than that. And boy was there ever. One day, Dad drives over to Uncle Joe's to borrow a hacksaw or something. He knocks on the front door and there's no answer, but instead of just driving back empty-handed, he walks into the backyard to let himself in the back door. The back door is open and my dad calls out for Uncle Joe, but again, there's no reply. His truck was in the driveway and his dogs were in the kitchen, so Dad figured that his brother was home, and he was. He was hanging by a necktie in his closet, and my dad was the one that found him. Dad said Uncle Joe was still warm when he found him and he tried CPR to bring him back, but it was no good. After that, he went out to his car, called 911, and just sat there crying until they showed up. I can't imagine how painful that must have been for him. Finding out your brother just took his own life is one thing, but being the one to find him, that's a whole other level of messed up. A lot of folks attended his funeral, all asking why Joe would do something like that because, to everyone that knew him, it was a complete mystery. He had no history of depression or anything like that, and I know some people can hide that stuff really well, so at this point, it's almost cliché to say no one saw it coming. But Dad said that in Uncle Joe's case, that cliché applied double. He was a man's man, loved hunting and shooting, but he also wasn't one to bottle up his feelings. If he had a problem or something on his mind, he wasn't afraid to share it, and my dad was usually his first person to call. So as heartbroken and blindsided as everyone was, the worst thing was being plagued by the question of why. But just a few weeks later, Dad gets a call from the county sheriff who asks if he can stop by to have a talk with him. Dad said he had no idea what the sheriff might want to talk about, but wasn't suspicious of anything because they'd been in touch quite often since he found his brother's body. But when he got there and said what he had to say, it changed everything. In the weeks that followed Uncle Joe taking his own life, the local sheriff's department conducted a thorough investigation into the incident. They didn't want to speculate on what might have happened until they had all the available evidence, but once they did, an extremely chilling picture began to emerge, one that was all summed up in Joe's note. As you already know, all Joe did was hang himself in his closet, but according to the note, that's not what he planned to do, as it contained a long-winded apology on why he had to kill his whole family. He hadn't just planned on taking his own life, he had planned on killing my dad, my mom, and me, along with Lord knows who else before he finally decided to check out early. Obviously, Uncle Joe hadn't done that. He hadn't hurt anyone but himself. But there was also no mention or explanation in this note as to why he hadn't followed through with his plan. He'd obviously put some degree of thought into it. All his guns were loaded up and ready to rock, and all the spare ammo that he was packing suggested that he was planning on killing way more people than just me and my parents. But then, for some reason, when it came to actually going through with it, I guess he had second thoughts. Maybe he did what he did as a way of protecting us. I mean, that's what I choose to believe anyway. As for my parents, they don't know what to think, and when it came to that part of the conversation, my dad excused himself and left the room. Mom was still angry, and she said it wasn't at me for bringing it up, but you could tell she'd rather have kept the whole thing buried. If they didn't tell me, I might have gone digging for info myself, and with Uncle Joe's death certificate being up in that attic too, it was only a matter of time before I uncovered it of my own volition. Mom later told me that she gets mad because Dad has the same take that I do, that in a weird way, Uncle Joe is kind of a hero for what he did. It's like he killed the monster who was going to kill us, it's just that monster was him, somewhere inside his own head. I know that's messed up to say because ideally Uncle Joe didn't do any of that stuff and went and got himself whatever help he needed. That's what makes my mom so mad too, is how my dad thinks of Joe as some kind of saint when, on any other day, he's driving over and gunning us down, along with God knows how many other people. But he didn't do that, because whoever planned on killing us, I choose to believe that wasn't my Uncle Joe. I'm not saying it was the devil or anything, but something took control of him, like a bug in a video game or something. His code went all wrong for a second, and when he realized what he was about to do, it scared him so bad that he did what he did, before it could take control of him again. Like I said, in an ideal world, Uncle Joe is still alive, but we don't live in an ideal world, and we gotta take our heroes wherever we can get them. So I guess it's rest in peace, Uncle Joe. I wish I understood what happened to you, but I guess the next best thing is being alive to wonder. After my dad passed away, my wife and I moved my mom in with us, and she got to spend her last few years in the comfort of family. We couldn't afford a home, but even if we did have the money, she'd never have accepted living in one. The way she saw it, selling the house and saving on retirement home money meant more cash towards our kids' college fund. But first, I'd have to clean the place out, do a little redecorating, then put the place on the market. And so one day, I went over to the house to start clearing it out. I started with the ground floors, made my way to the second, and then finally, I was faced with clearing out the attic. But then as I was doing so, I realized a lot of the stuff up there amounted to a chronicling of my family history. There were all kinds of photo albums, mementos from Hawaiian vacations, and then a whole folder stuffed with pieces of paperwork like birth and death certificates. And that's how I found out my last name was not actually my last name, and that at some point, my parents had gone about changing the name of our family. From what I could tell, this all took place when I was 4 years old, so it was no wonder I had no memory of it. But then, as you can imagine, I was intensely curious as to why this name change took place, so the first chance I got, I asked my mom about it. I already figured that the reason a whole family might change their name probably wasn't a good one. We'd been either running from something or hiding something, or probably a combination of the two. So when I put aside the time to actually sit down with Mom, show her the paperwork, and ask why our family changed its name, I knew it wasn't going to be an easy 2-minute explanation. The kids were at school, my wife was at work, and Mom was watching TV in our living room. Then, in as delicate a manner as possible, I asked my mom if we could talk, and then showed her the paperwork that proved that she and my dad had changed our family name. I'd expected some kind of emotional reaction, but instead, Mom acted resigned to my question. She knew that I'd probably find the paperwork during the process of clearing their home, which for the record wasn't the same one that I grew up in. The thought had occurred to her, and it had panicked her at first, but since the events in question were more than 40 years old, it was always an inevitability that I'd find out in some way. She figured then would be as good a time as ever. Mom explained that I had an uncle that I'd never been aware of, one who died when I was still in diapers. The circumstances of his death had caused a great scandal, so to avoid being harangued by journalists and vigilante types, my parents decided to change our name, then moved across the country to begin a new life. I think Mom tried to avoid telling me what I actually wanted to know. It was like watching her taking bites out of each side of a devil dog, carefully scraping away the cake part, too scared to get to what holds it all together. I had to ask her directly to get her to tell me, and this, in so many words, is what she said in return. My paternal uncle and my future aunt by marriage met while they were in college. They had an on-again, off-again relationship, and apparently my father believed it was doomed. But then suddenly, and inexplicably, they announced that they were engaged. Again, my dad thought that they'd eventually just break it off. They weren't a good fit, and it seemed only a matter of time before they broke things off for good. But then when it came to the wedding, my dad said that he slowly realized what his brother saw in his new bride. Her family were very rich. From what Mom said, they were old and new money. All their cash came down from way before, and they'd invested it wisely, and it showed. Mom said they owned a chain of canning factories or something, and this is back when canning was a much bigger industry. So in short, they were loaded. Dad knew it was a bad idea to marry for money, but my uncle wouldn't listen. and he and his bride were married in a lavish ceremony at some country estate. The first few months lived up to the term honeymoon period, but after that it was back to business as usual. There were fights, talk of annulment and divorce, but still the couple went on, and with my uncle having become accustomed to a certain lifestyle, he wasn't willing to give up easily. And then came the accident. My aunt and uncle had been out hiking when my aunt had apparently taken a nasty fall. She was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries, and the doctors managed to save her life, but after the surgery, our family got the bad news. She would never walk again and was unlikely to regain the use of her arms. She proved the doctors wrong on the second part. Well, half wrong in that she regained the use of one of her arms, but she was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Mom and Dad noticed that my uncle was acting strangely in the aftermath of the accident, but I mean, who wouldn't? Even if their relationship was rocky, he still loved his wife in some capacity. At least my parents thought so. So it was only natural that my uncle wasn't in a good place following the accident. They had to remodel their house, the prospect of children was pretty much off the table, and it was a terrible transitionary time, but everyone adjusted. Or so they thought. One day my dad gets a call from my grandpa who had some more bad news. My uncle was dead, and so was my aunt. Both had taken their own lives. Obviously, this was incredibly shocking news, but that wasn't all of it. As things progressed, the family got more and more info, learning that my uncle had hung himself first before my aunt had overdosed on pills. And before she did, she left a note. Only my father and grandfather actually read it, and as far as I know, it's back in some evidence file someplace if it's not already been destroyed. But what it said was even more shocking than the acts that immediately surrounded its writing. Basically, my aunt's accident wasn't an accident. My uncle had pushed her. They had an argument, and she hit him, and he shoved her. She fell back way further than he'd intended to shove her, then down the rocky hillside she went, never to fully recover. I guess my uncle could have just finished her off there and then, but he didn't, and she never breathed a word of the shove to the police. Instead, my aunt pretended to let bygones be bygones. I don't know how she pulled it off, but she did, when in reality, she was intent on revenge. All the letter said was that she wore him down until he did it, and God knows what the hell that entailed exactly. But I imagine she played a lot on his guilt and how he was trapped with her, whatever hurt the most, until finally he just couldn't take it anymore. Obviously, there were no arrests or anything, but boy did the media want to know all about my uncle and his relationship with my aunt. And to get answers, they sought out my dad. All the unwanted attention was really bad for our family, and apparently some people got it into their heads that my dad was somehow in on it. They vandalized the house while I was sleeping in my crib, and after that, Dad started looking at jobs and houses out of state, as well as looking at a potential change of name. Mom said they planned on telling me when I was ready, but then who the hell decides when that is? They put it off and put it off until eventually they decided it was just best to keep it a secret. They feared the bombshell might upset the progress myself and my siblings were making in life, and that's on top of the fact that they just didn't want to revisit such a painful period of our lives. I actually get it too. I don't know how I'd have handled that kind of burden personally, but I give them a solid 8 out of 10 for their own execution. Finding out as a grown adult was traumatic, so I can only imagine how I'd have reacted if they told me at age 15 or 18 or even 21. It's definitely something that I still think about from time to time, but frankly, the fact that I can view it as almost like an unrelated third party, it sort of feels like a privilege at this point. It's messed up and it hurts to think about, but not nearly as much as it would if I had to grow up with it stuck in my head. In that sense, I understand why my parents kept it a secret from me. Heck, I pretty much endorse and applaud it at this point. Sometimes, secrets need to be kept because at a certain age, uncomfortable, unpalatable, or incomprehensible truths can be just as wounding as a knife or bullet. I see it everywhere. Kids who grow up knowing too much too soon, They're old before their time in a way, and it's something they carry with them into adulthood. But I didn't have to carry anything with me. I never had any kind of mental burden forced upon me. My parents did the opposite. They shielded me from it, and for that, I'm very grateful.